Hello, and a very warm IISS welcome to today's Japan Chair Programme webinar, Japan's post-COVID-19 economic challenges. I'm Robert Ward, IISS Japan Chair and Director of Geoeconomics and Strategy, and together with my colleague Yuka Koshino, IISS Research Fellow for Japanese Security and Defence Policy, I'll be chairing today's event. It's great that we have such a large and international audience for this session, stretching right around the world. It's gratifying to see such keen global interest in Japan's economy. I can think of few better placed guests to help us to navigate Japan's economic challenge than our esteemed guest today, David Atkinson, who's joining us from Tokyo, Japan. I think it's fair to say that David is one of only a handful of non-Japanese people to be working on Japanese economic policy at the very highest levels of the Japanese government. Key areas of focus for David in his work with the government are Japan's small and medium-sized enterprises, SMEs, Japan's productivity and demographic challenges, and of course, tourism. Indeed, David was one of the architects of Japan's recent tourism policy, which until the pandemic struck was arguably one of the best successes economically of the Abe administration. I think David is on, or has been on, around 30 Japanese government committees. Perhaps this is a record for a foreigner, or perhaps even a record for a Japanese person. I think it certainly shows impressive stamina. And on top of all this, David also has a day job as CEO of one of Japan's leading shrine and temple restorers, Konishi Decorative Arts and Crafts. So he has first-hand experience of navigating the complexities of Japan's business environment. He's also a visiting professor at Nara Prefectural University. David's lived in Japan since 1990, I think, so he's very well equipped to give us ample context into how Japan's economy is evolving. David also speaks enviably beautiful Japanese. Before we start, I'd like to outline the order of play today and set out some housekeeping rules. Can we have the Q&A slide, please? Thank you. This webinar will last around 1 hour. For the first 30 minutes or so, Yuka and I will be in conversation with David, after which we will open the virtual floor to questions. I know many of you will have joined a webinar before, but just to be ultra safe, I'll explain the Q&A procedure. To ask a written question, please use the Q&A button, or to ask a question directly, please raise the blue hand, and our brilliant technical team will unmute you. You can write your question at any time during the webinar. Where we can, we'll group similar questions so that we can answer as many of your questions as possible. It's always good to have questions lined up, so please don't be shy, don't hold back. And please state your affiliation when you're asking a question. As we only have 1 hour, I'll need to be very strict with timekeeping. So if you want to ask a question to David, please limit yourself to one question, and questions please, not statements. And finally, this session is on the record and will be posted on due course on the IISS's website at www.iiss.org. David, thank you for your time today and a warm welcome to our webinar.
Thank you. Good to see you.
So, first question on Japan's economy, and again, to put it in a COVID wrapper, if you like, Japan, like many countries, will have quite a poor year this year in terms of its economy, probably experiencing its worst recession since the end of the Second World War. Some forecasts I've seen posit a slow recovery, suggesting that Japan's economy, the level of GDP, won't recover until 2019 levels, until around 2024. So a severe cyclical shock to the economy, but do you think there'll be a deeper structural economic impact on Japan as a result of this economic dislocation?
Well, I think if one looks back at the last 30 years that I've, for example, been in Japan, since 1993, the Japanese economy has basically gyrated between about 520 and 560 trillion yen. After the Lehman shock, that was basically the range within which it moved, and most of the numbers that we're looking at suggest that it will may fall to somewhere around about 500 trillion, but it'll probably sit at around about the 500 trillion floor. And I think when people look at it and say, well, it's going to go back to where it was in 2019 at some point in the future, they're actually talking about it going back to the same level it's been pretty much unchanged for the last 20 years or so.
So what does that mean in terms of the structural impact on the economy, do you think? I mean,
probably very little.
So your work on productivity, for example, you've been doing a lot of work with the Japanese government on productivity.
Right.
How does Japan sort of raise its productivity to raise that GDP level?
Yeah, I mean, the most important thing I think to understand about the Japanese economy, and this will be something that the rest of the world will, so the developed world will see at some point, is if one thinks about GDP in very, very simple terms, it's basically the number of people employed multiplied by the productivity of each one of those people employed. And obviously the calculation of GDP is more complicated from a technical perspective, but basically you can boil it down to those two factors. According to a lot of the economic analysis, since the war, the global economy has grown on average 3.6% since 1945, globally. And of that, if you break it down into those two factors that I just mentioned, population growth has been 1.8% and productivity growth has been 1.8%, so half and half. If you, according to McKinsey, between now and 2070, if we assume that productivity growth is the same, population growth is expected to be around about 0.3%, which means that all else being equal, you would expect global economic growth to fall from 3.6 to 2.1%. Now, if you look at Japan within that, the population stopped growing in 1993, and productivity has basically gone sideways since then. And I have, in a lot of the work I've done with the government and in the now 12 books that I've written about this in the last 6 years, taking that very, very simple idea, if the population goes sideways and productivity goes sideways, which is what happens, then of course what that means is that the Japanese economy will go sideways. Now, a lot of people will look at Japan and say, well, they need more deregulation, or they need a freer economy, or it's because of a decrease in technological skills or whatever. But actually, if you think about it in much more simple terms, the government did nothing to focus on the increase in productivity, and the population went sideways, and therefore it shouldn't be a surprise that for the last 25 years the economy has gone nowhere. From now until 2050, the population will drop by 42%. So unless productivity goes up, the economy will essentially implode upon itself. And that has been, for the last 6 years, I keep telling you, you don't have a choice. If you don't raise productivity, the economy will implode. End of story. And so you have to ask the question, well, how then do you get productivity to increase?
And what's your sense of the policy priorities there in terms of increasing productivity?
Well, when I first started talking about productivity increases, the population, working population versus productivity, there was an overwhelming negative backlash against that. People would not accept it. They believed that that the numbers were wrong, or that productivity was a Western imposition or a cultural imposition and various other things. It took about 3 years to get people to understand that the future of the Japanese economy is entirely caught up in what they do with productivity. And if one really thinks about productivity growth, and you cut through all the rubbish that people talk about, and you start you start peeling it back layer by layer by layer, you eventually come down to the very, very simple realization that the single largest factor in why Japanese productivity is so low versus the rest of the world is because the average corporate size is about 60% of the size of the US and about 2/3 of the size of the EU. And everything flows from that. If you ask, why is Japan so behind in terms of implementation of technology? Technology investment and the leveraging of technology in business is, whether you look at the OECD analysis or anybody else's analysis, the smaller a corporate is in terms of its overall number of employees and its overall level of revenues and profits, the less likely it is that it's going to be able to invest in and utilize technology. If you look at, for example, Kathy Matsui, who I used to work with at Goldman, and her arguments on diversity in Japan, the very, very low level of utilization of the female workforce, especially at senior levels, there is a very, very strong correlation between the average size of companies and the diversity level across the world. And certainly, if you do the analysis, you will find that of the 3.6 million companies in Japan, 3 million of them employ on average 3.4 people. Now you can imagine trying to implement a diversity strategy with maternity leave and various other things when your average corporate size is 3.4 people. And it took me probably 4 years to get to break down the analysis to that level. It took me 4 years to get there, and having got there, of course, you have this epiphany moment where you think, oh, of course, that's blindingly obvious. And that is really going to be Japan's largest challenge. If you look around the world, Japan has one of the highest percentages of people working for micro and mini companies in the developed world. Second only to Spain, Greece, and Italy. And if there's one thing, of course, that everyone who's familiar with levels of productivity globally will immediately think, oh, Spain, Italy, Greece, the lowest productivity companies in the EU and in the developed world. And just to put that in context, Japan was 26th globally in 1990 and is 34th in 2019, according to the World Bank, and that puts it behind Italy, Greece, Turkey, Korea for the first time. Korea was number 51 in 1990, and Slovenia.
So given the importance of these micro companies, SMEs to Japan, I was looking the other day, and I think they employ about 70% of the workforce. So there's a big chunk of Japan that's involved with these firms. I was also looking at some of the OECD data. I think you also cited, and yes, I mean, Japan's productivity in the SME sector is pretty low. So given all of this, what can the government do about it? Because clearly, to raise this growth rate that we've been talking about will require quite active policy implementation for the SME sector. So what do you think the government should do?
Yeah. I spent a lot of time looking at the historical reasons why Japan got itself into this mess. And it dates back to 1964, or more precisely 1963, which was the point at which Japan was admitted into the OECD. And when they did that, they implemented a whole string of laws, which meant that, for example, the definition of a medium and small size company was set at 300 for manufacturing people and 50 for everyone else in services. They then implemented a whole series of regulations and tax policies which provide vast quantities of support to very, very small companies. And in some wonderful research being done in France and Portugal and Italy and various other countries, if you implement very, very strong supportive policy, especially in tax, set on the basis of the number of people employed, and you set those levels at very, very low limits, what will happen is the working population will collect into the areas which are subsidized. And those companies will grow to the limits, and then they will bunch at that level and stop. So this problem was actually, it was artificially created by government policy and is supported by the level of the minimum wage. If you have a very, very supportive tax policy for very, very small companies, and most of these companies are not economically viable in any other scenario other than when you support them with the lowest level of minimum wage relative to the median in the OECD, except for Mexico. There are 28 countries in the OECD that implement the minimum wage, and Japan is 25th equal, and it's way, way below anywhere else in the. And of course, if you look at that, if you provide very, very well trained and educated people at ludicrously low levels of wages, then you are, and then provide tax incentives, you are incentivizing people to produce or to create very, very low productivity level companies. And that's exactly what they've done. And so and it makes it actually a relatively easy thing to deal with, because all you need to do is you need to remove these very, very low limits on the definition of a medium and small size company, and then progressively raise the minimum wage in order to force people to consolidate the medium and small size corporate sector up, so that you unleash the economies of scale that allows you to become more productive. And it's a very, very simple thing to do in intellectual terms. Unfortunately, of course, it does mean that you have to unwind economic policy that has been in place for the best part of 60 years. And there is an enormous intellectual hurdle that has to be crossed and jumped over in order to get there. And then there's an emotional one in the sense that you've got 3 million companies who are owned by people who have been essentially milking the Japanese economy for the benefits provided by abnormally low levels of wages relative to very, very strong levels of education and infrastructure. And that, I think, is a much more difficult issue to deal with, because you're dealing with a purely political decision with a very large number of people whose economic interests are best served by continuing to milk the economy of trillions of yen worth of subsidies every year.
So Japan's SME sector is also aging, like the rest of the country, and just sort of bring the conversation briefly to aging before I pass to Yuka. Japan's ahead of the curve demographically, but it's not unique. I think South Korea is aging more quickly than Japan. Right. Parts of Eastern Germany look not dissimilar to Japan. So Japan's experiencing what others will experience ahead of the curve. I'd be interested in your views. Are there things from your knowledge of how Japan's dealing with aging and demographic change that you think other countries could learn from? Are there any successes that you could point to in terms of policy?
No, because I think the rest of the world is going to have the same problem. For example, we're all very used to the idea that the US is economically more successful than Europe is. and people will point to the consistently higher level of GDP growth over time than is true for Europe. If you break that down, a very large percentage of the difference in overall GDP growth between the US and Europe, and that's, people say, well, Europe, they just can't get their technology right, and growth rates are consistently low, and all these things. A very large part of the difference is the fact that the US population grows at a much faster rate than is true in Europe. And if you break it down into productivity and population growth, then you will see that. And I think a lot of people just haven't worked that one out. How do you grow an economy in the absence of population growth? And I think most people have not got their heads around what percentage of actual economic growth is coming from population growth relative to coming from productivity growth. Having said that, your point on Korea and Germany is one of the problems that I face in Japan, which is that people tend to think in terms of concepts rather than numbers. And it is true that Korea is aging faster than Japan and that Germany has its own problems, but the scale of those issues are much, much different. Between here and 2050, I think the Korean population overall is expected to drop by around about 6%, whereas Japan is 32%. And last time I looked, Germany was expected to drop 11%, and I think now is expected to drop 9%. And if you look at Italy and Spain, which are two other countries with expected decreases in population, for both of those economies, you're also looking at around about a 10% decrease. Now, I also think it's interesting to note that the countries with very, very low productivity and also with very, very low participation in the workforce, especially at senior levels by women, are also the very same countries that have very, very low birth rates and are expected to increase, expected to see the biggest decreases in their population, with the exception of Germany, which is the only major developed country that is not in the low productivity, low female participation, low birth rate camp.
Those, as you say, Japan's demographic statistics are absolutely striking, particularly the not least the population fall. And of course, this has implications for Japan's regions. Great swathes of the country are depopulating. So do you see that the government has, again, viable policies to deal with those bits of the country that are losing their people at a rate of knots?
No. Again, I'll go back to what I was saying earlier on. When I first started talking about productivity growth and how you get it to change, most of the university professors here made this argument, which is there is no, and this was actually a bunch of very, very senior economics professors, there is no connection at all between population and GDP. That was their argument. And even if you have GDP growth, because there is no connection between these two things, then all you need to do is improve technology, and Japan is very good at technology, and the economy will grow. And that was their argument. And for some of them, it continues to be their argument today. They argue, you need more investment in IT, and if Japanese companies spend more on IT and they change the way they work, then miraculously the economy will grow. How you do that when the number of very active consumers is about to drop by 42%, and to argue that this will have no impact on the economy because you can just implement some IT, and with 5G everything will be fine. And in textbook economics arguments, that is true. It's what I'm saying. Population goes down, technology goes up, productivity goes up, everything is fine. But as these macroeconomists, they've missed the point that you have to work out, as you say, what are the policies that get you from productivity, which has not moved for the best part of, in terms of global rankings, has not gone up once in the last 50 years. where most of the growth in GDP has come from population growth, how do you implement policies that get you from A to B? And in most cases, they have this rather charming view that, well, we have technology, we're Japan, it's the third largest economy, we work very hard, productivity will just go up. It's charming in its naivety, but that's what it is.
I think it's now time to hand the chair to Yuka, who I think has some questions on your other area of interest, I think tourism.
Thank you, Robert. And thank you, David, for the fascinating discussion. I have some questions about Japan's tourism strategy. So under this government, inbound tourism has been the economic engine of Japan, and Japan aspires to become a tourism-oriented country. And they have set goals to double its tourist numbers to 40 million by 2020 and 60 million by 2030. However, the COVID-19 has been upsetting the current situation and the goals, and tourism is also vulnerable to external shocks. So, do you still think that tourism should be one of the key pillars for Japanese economic policy going forward?
Yeah, I mean, if one looks at tourism over time, there was tourism before the Black Death, and there is obviously tourism in the centuries after the Black Death, because that's what you're talking about. The population of Europe over the course of 50 years dropped by half. I think that was a somewhat more dramatic decrease than is true with what's happening today. And the history of mankind is the history of pandemics and ways of dealing with them and getting over it, and GDP growth has continued over time. Who knows when the tourism will come back? That's largely a political decision. I'm not going to guess as to when it will be back to the growth rates, the growth trajectory that it was on. I do think the growth trajectory has been somewhat moved down, but I think that the direction itself is unchanged. When I was talking a moment ago with Robert about GDP, one of the things that's true, and this was my argument to the Japanese government about why they needed an inbound tourism strategy, the number of temples, shrines, national parks is not going to decrease as a result of population decreases. But the number of people visiting those places is going to go down because of the decrease in the number of consumers. And in that particular case, you have two options. You can either, blow up half of your heritage, close down half of your national parks, or if you don't have the same number of Japanese people to consume them, then you can export them. And tourism, of course, is people come here, so we import people, but it's considered an export. It's considered an export because you're earning foreign currency. And the argument was, well, if you've got a massive decrease in the number of domestic tourists, then you're going to have some tourists from overseas. And, I spent an enormous amount of time with the government working out how to do that. And when we started 6 years ago, there were 8 million people coming. Last year, there were 32, so it went up by a factor of 4 in 5 years. And Japan went from 24th, I think, globally in terms of tourism revenues, most of which actually wasn't tourism. Most of it was business people who are classified as on tourism visas. And that went up to 9th globally before, obviously, the world closed down. That doesn't change. Either they will, the inbound tourism strategy is an answer to the decrease in domestic tourism. And as I said, your only choice is pursue an inbound strategy or close down sizable swathes of your domestic tourism industry, which will decrease the overall level of GDP.
Thank you. So on that point, So how would you also advise the government in the current situation to enhance the resilience in the tourism industry right now when we, for instance, think about the with Corona situation? And do you think for instance, the GoTo campaign or GoTo Travel, which is the government's campaign to subsidize 50% of the travelers' expense, is that an effective solution for the industry to survive during the uncertainties?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting fact that that the lowest productivity sectors in the economy are retail and hospitality and tourism. They are not only the lowest, they are the lowest by a very, very long stretch. And interestingly, what's happening at the moment, of course, is that the pandemic is in a sense focusing in on the weakest sections of the Japanese economy. And the GoTo campaign is interesting insofar as the government is not providing subsidies to tourist-related companies on a pro rata basis. It's providing subsidies to people to actual domestic tourism, which means that the providers of hotels, food services, and various other things who have been selected by the consumer will be the ones who get government support. And that, I think, is a point that most people have missed. But they could have just said, you know, if you're registered in the tourism industry, then we'll just give you a blanket handout, in which case you would have simply subsidized everybody. But they didn't do it that way. It is focused upon the long-term survivors. Until people come back, then I think there's actually very little the government can do other than provide some form of subsidy. There is some debate about whether the GoTo campaign is a good idea or a bad idea, too early, blah, blah, blah. But the reality is, of course, it has nothing to do with that. What is really required here is to get people tested, whether you go on the train or not, you know, whether you live in Tokyo or not, whether Tokyo is seeing an increase in infections or not, is completely misses the point. The point is, in order for people to be able to move around the country, they should be tested first. And if they were tested, then we wouldn't need to have this silly argument about, is it too early, is it not too early, should people in Tokyo be, should they not be able to receive subsidies or not? You know, those are secondary and I think somewhat silly arguments.
Right. I think the government also has, for instance, in the supplemental budget to support the tourist industries to invest in infrastructures for inbound tourism. But I think, again, absolutely, that's also true for providing support to the long-time survivors in the COVID-19.
That's absolutely right. That has been, I mean, sorry, the two areas that I have spent most of my time on, and where I think, you know, the biggest contributions have been made have been for government policy to be based predominantly on research and analysis and working out where the bottlenecks are and doing something about it. Traditionally, a lot of Japanese policy, it goes back to what Robert and I were talking about, a lot of Japanese policy is all done in concepts. Population down, technology up, GDP, it'll be fine. MMT, you know, everything will be great. You know, super cities, fine, you know, will be great. You know, JETRO, let's export things, the economy will begin to grow. Nobody sits down and works out, you know, what the real economics and business case of that is. And that was also true in tourism. There was a tourism strategy before I arrived, and the tourism numbers went nowhere. And when I arrived, because I'm an analyst by training, you know, we looked at ways of of what was it that made people come to Japan, and I think one of the largest contributions that was made was, why do people who don't come to Japan not come to Japan, and what can we do to remove or to incentivize them to come here? And that was one of the reasons why you saw this explosion in the numbers, that according to the UNWTO, the increase in Japanese tourism is the largest increase by a major developed country in history. And a very large portion of that was a very, very careful analysis of what needed to be done. And the second thing, of course, was, as you mentioned, I believe, and I continue to say this, that in a social media world, the value of advertising, please come to Japan, it's a great place, is radically reduced because people can get first-hand information on how good a customer experience was at a given tourism site, because they can get it on Tripadvisor, and they can get on the net, and they can get it from their friends on Facebook. Whereas traditionally, you just advertise the hell out of things, and you could get people, and if people had a horrible experience, it's actually very, very difficult, unless you were picked up by the television or the newspaper, to get that out to a large audience. Whereas now, of course, if it was a really great experience, it goes around the world in moments. And I've argued that for the Japanese tourism industry, what that means is they need to spend a lot less money on stupid things like branding and logos and catchphrases and endless commercials, and spend most of their money on finding out what people don't like about the customer experience and improving it. And government strategy at the moment, if you look at it, whether it's the tax structure that was implemented, whether it's a lot of the government policies, almost all of it is focused on how do you invest in the infrastructure to make the customer experience first class, so that people will do most of the advertising for you. And I think that's probably one of the largest, if not the largest, reasons for why the Japanese tourism strategy has been so incredibly successful.
Thank you. That's a very interesting point. And I would like to hand back the discussion to Robert.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Thank you, Yuka. We've got some questions have come in. So perhaps start with the written questions. One from my old friend, John Naish, ex of the Japan Society. John writes, with its present economic structure, will increasing productivity, which I take to mean increased output for the same input, require Japan to increase its international current balance? And if so, how is this likely to be received?
Well, the short answer to that is yes. Exports, Japan is the world's 4th largest exporter, behind Germany. Interestingly enough, and this actually is a key point that I would like to make. When I studied the Japanese economy at Oxford, and in the many years that I spent as an analyst, one of the things that I had never received a good explanation for was why the Japanese economy was at that point the world's 2nd largest economy. Everyone said, the Japanese work hard, they live long, they're very well educated, and their society is very stable. And that's why it's the 2nd largest. And people would say to me, well, David, the Japanese economy is twice the size of the UK economy, and that's because we're twice as technologically sophisticated as you are. And some of those arguments seem to be reasonable, but it didn't quite explain to me why it was that it was 2 and not 3 or 5 or 1. And it was at that point that, since I had never received a good argument for this, that I started breaking down GDP into its various different components. And it was at that point that I realized that the reason that, if you look in the list for developed countries only, I will say, if you look at the absolute size of GDP for developed countries, the ranking is 100% correlated with the number of people that are a population of your country. And GDP and exports is another one of those factors. Japan is the world's 10th largest population. It's the second largest population for a developed country, 1.5 times the size of Germany. And therefore, it has the largest GDP in absolute terms of any Asian country, any Asian developed country. And it shouldn't be surprising that therefore is a very large exporter. But this is the key thing. It's a very large GDP, but if you look at productivity, which is GDP per head of population, it drops from being number 3 to number 28 in terms of absolute population, and number 35 in terms of productivity per employed person. In absolute terms, Japan is 4th in terms of exports, but in terms of exports relative to the size of GDP, it is 166th. And if you go back to Yuka's point on tourism, Japan was nowhere in terms of tourism and is now 9th. Relative to GDP, it's still relatively small. And all of that is net export earnings. So yes, I think Japan has been a large absolute exporter, but a very small exporter in relative terms. And that has to change over time, or Japanese government debt and Japanese government spending, especially in terms of pensions and healthcare, are going to have to be reined in very, very radically. So I think actually they have no choice. What the rest of the world does with that, who knows?
Thank you, David. And thank you, John, for that question. I'm going to go to one of our blue hands, if I may. Gordon Wilson, please. Could you unmute Gordon, please?
Thank you very much, Chairman. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, I wanted to particular tourist things onto sport. And I was there for the Rugby World Cup, which was an enormous success to everyone who came into the country. And it has the advantage of rugby being a sort of social thing, that between matches you had time to look around the country a lot. And I think that must have been a huge boost to you. And a lot of people converted to Japan who didn't know before want to come back. The Olympic Games, on the other hand, is something, and I'm going to get into that, is where you go to one place and you go on a daily basis and you really don't get round too much. So my question is, how has there been any detrimental effects on the economy as a result of the Olympic Games being put back for a year? Both economically, what's the impact economically and perhaps politically? And is it still something as so much prestige to it that this will overcome perhaps the shortcomings and the expense of having to put it back?
Gordon Wilson, could you just state your affiliation, please? Perhaps we've muted him.
I'm a fellow at RUSI and a member here for 38 years.
Fantastic, thank you. David.
Well, I guess it would have had a positive, or should have had a positive economic impact, which isn't going to show up in the numbers now. There is a small negative impact at the moment from some of the extra expenses being incurred, but there's an opportunity cost which doesn't obviously show up in the numbers. Politically, who knows? I'm not qualified to comment on that. In terms of the tourism strategy, does it make a difference? I think probably not. I think I agree with your point on rugby, and I was very closely involved with the rugby strategy. which I thought, I'm glad to hear you thought went well. In terms of the Olympics, it is very much a media event, and obviously a participant event. The number of people coming here is much smaller. In order to watch the Olympics is much smaller than the number of people who come to cover it in the press and television and various other things. So I think from a tourism strategy, it makes almost no difference. Generally speaking, as I'm sure you've seen, the Olympics tends to have a small negative impact in the year, sorry, small positive impact in the year that it takes place, and a negative impact in the year afterwards, and then it makes no difference over a longer period of time. In Japan, I said rather charmingly, they believe that holding the Olympics means that that this has a positive impact on people wanting to travel to Japan. I think the likelihood of that is actually quite small. I fail to see why, when we started doing this 6 years ago, I failed to see why somebody would say, "Oh, there's going to be the Olympics in Japan 5 years from now, so let's go this summer." And I constantly, I do a lot of speeches to sort of, to get people in the regional areas of Japan to jump on the tourism bandwagon. I am their sort of, traveling St. Paul when it comes to these things. And when I give these speeches, we can get 400 to 1,000 people. I think the largest audience I've had is 3,000 people. And I asked them, they had the Olympics in Brazil. How many of you went to Brazil before, during, or afterwards as a tourist because they were having the Olympics in Brazil? And so far, in 5 years, nobody has ever raised their hand. So, I have to say I'm a deep skeptic on that one. And, I think the Olympic Games, therefore, it's an interesting to do. I think there are obviously some impacts, but they're not nearly as large as people expect. I do think if there's any impact at all, it's a psychological impact that, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. People think that there's going to be a big impact of tourism. They spend a lot of money investing in it. The tourists come because the Japanese are investing in their tourism infrastructure, and therefore it appears as if the Olympics has directly impacted the tourism strategy. But for those of us who are very, very closely involved with it on a daily basis, that simply isn't true. That's a coincidence.
Thank you, David. I have a written question here. It's actually the first question we got, so I should prioritize this one. From Laurent Haveraj, who is the advisor to the Honorary Consul of San Marino in the UK. Many thanks to the panelists for sharing with us their very useful insights on Japan's economy and its challenges. It's expected that the post-COVID-19 recovery in countries like Canada, France, Germany will be swift by international standards owing to their generous furlough schemes and massive fiscal stimulus programs. What is the situation in Japan in terms of applying economic stimulus packages?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the problems, of course, with Japan is that you have the world's worst fiscal situation, which I think has enormous problems, causes enormous problems. This debt to GDP is currently 220%. And so that's one issue that you face. The other one, and I actually wrote about this, I spent a lot of time thinking about this recently, because there has been this argument in Japan that if you jump on the MMT bandwagon and you have a massive government stimulus, then productivity will go up and everything will be fine. And this is another one of these, conceptual stories that sounds great, but when you do the analysis, you are fighting the incredible inefficiency of the structure of corporate Japan. And we're not talking about hankos and faxes and stuff like that. We're talking about the distribution of the workforce over different sizes of corporate entity. And I like to explain this. If you had two countries with 3,000 people working for them, you can either have, at either extreme, you can have 3 companies with 1,000 people each, or you can have 1,000 people with 3 people each. And it doesn't take a genius to work out that that those two countries will not have the same productivity. And so the argument on fiscal stimulus is attractive. But I think if you look at the MMT argument, a lot of these arguments on fiscal stimulus come from the Keynesian argument that the way to improve GDP growth is to raise employment closer to full employment and raise productivity as a result of that by an increase in employment participation. And this is a little technical maybe, but if you had actual employment productivity of say 10 million yen and 50% of the population were employed, then your national level of productivity would be 10 million multiplied by 50%, which would be 5 million yen per person. By increasing government spending, if you can get from 50% to 60%, then your overall level of productivity will go from 5 million to 6 million, even though individual worker productivity has not increased. And you can continue to do that until you reach full employment. And when you reach full employment, either you get inflation or the level of worker productivity has to go up. And as I mentioned, as I keep mentioning, that is very, very closely linked to technology, which is very, very closely linked to the average size of company in your corporate base. Japan is now very, very close to full employment. They have seen a 3.7 million people increase in the workforce, in the employed workforce over the course of the Abe administration the last 6 years, against the backdrop of a 4.2 million people decrease in the number of people of working age. And we're now at the point where 90% of people of normal working age, which is defined by the OECD as 16 to 64, 15 to 64, 90% of that workforce is now employed, and we are very, very close to reaching full employment. Japan has one of the highest levels of employment relative to employable people in the developed world. And that's gone up radically. It's the highest level it's ever been at any point in Japanese history. And so I think if you look at the US, if you look at Canada, I looked at recently, these are countries with relatively low levels of employment. And therefore, I think you get the argument, especially when you have population growth thrown into that, there's a very, very strong argument for government subsidy. Here, I think the argument has been strong. It's emotively appealing, but I think there are, you are, as I keep mentioning, we are very close to again hitting the wall of being able to raise productivity simply by increasing participation, which means that again, you come back to the incredible inefficiency of the Japanese corporate structure.
Thank you, David. We've got some really good looking questions here. So I'm going to take the chair's privilege and extend this session by 15 minutes. So I think we'll finish at 15 the hour. But I do want to get these questions in because they look good. I'm just going to go to the blue hand to Aiko Doden, please. Can you unmute Aiko Doden, please?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
This is Aiko Doden, journalist at NHK, Japan Broadcasting Corporation, also a IISS member. I have a question on productivity. As you know, definition of being diligent has long been working long hours, even overtime in Japanese working environment, and not productivity. But it seems that COVID-19 has significantly impacted Japanese working style, where telework is slowly taking on without choice in offices. But some are obviously uneasy because appraisal system or evaluation system is not quite there yet. But do you think this will be a kind of an epiphany moment for Japan, where this will lead to transforming people's mindset, where they realize once and for all, it's the productivity that matters and not long hours?
No. The long hour argument is, I think is, this is the most difficult thing to understand. I'll go back to what I was saying earlier on. When I was at university, I was never satisfied with the arguments that people presented as to why the Japanese economy was so large. And the arguments that were made were, people take the distinguishing features of Japanese work practices and they equate them with the size of GDP and in some cases productivity. So people will argue Japan went from being the 6th largest economy in the world to the 2nd largest economy in the world because Japanese people work hard, they're very well educated, they did calisthenics. I mean, when I was at Oxford, there were, Japan was at the top of its game. It was taking over the world, and we had Japan as #1 and all these other books, and it was because Japanese people didn't take holidays. They did calisthenics in the morning, when they wore a company badge, and the West, we should all do calisthenics and we should all have a company song and we should all live in company dormitories and we should all work very hard and not go home and not help out with with raising children, because those were the reasons why the Japanese economy was so big, growing so fast and so successful. And very unfortunately, I think people continue to take those coincidences and equate them as being, that they give them some form of causal effect, which they never had. And therefore, the opposite side of that is, well, Japanese people are unproductive. They work very long hours. If they didn't work very long hours, they would be more productive. You can see why the argument is appealing. Unfortunately, it's irrelevant. And therefore, if people work fewer hours, that will not create that much of a difference, because, to repeat myself, the problem with the Japanese economy, is that companies have insignificant scale in order to be able to implement significant levels of productivity increases. And whether you work 20 hours a day, 22 hours a day, or 10 hours a day, if the size of company that you work for doesn't change, and you continue to have below economically efficient sized companies employing a very large percentage of your population, then you can change the working practices as much as you want, and it will make very, very little difference. I mean, you raise a very, very good point there, which is that if you look at telework, and this is a major problem with the way people look at Japan, this happens to me all the time. People will say, oh, well, yes, but, I went to see NEC and NEC told me this or whatever. Just over 50% of all employees in the US work for large companies, a very large percentage of which are listed. In Japan, about 25% of the population works for large companies, where the definition of large companies is much smaller than is true for the US, which means when people come to Japan, they always talk about listed companies, which are, in the US, you would be talking about the majority of the economy, and therefore it would be acceptable, I think, to extrapolate between what you saw in listed companies and what was going on in the economy at large. But in Japan, you are talking about a visible but minority section of the economy. And if you look at this, people will say, well, Keidan-Ren companies, 98% of them have implemented telework or working at home. And therefore people will say, and therefore Japan is changing. But my whole point today is that large companies are a minority, and a very small minority of the Japanese economy. The majority of it is unlisted, is subscale. And if you look at it, you will see that the implementation of teleworking is inversely correlated with the size of company that you work for. And it's very difficult for me, I think, to get this point across because it's so contrary to what most people think about Japan. But for example, I was looking at something, people say Japanese people don't take holiday. Therefore, the government needs to regulate to force them to take more holiday. And they don't take holiday because Japanese people don't like to go home before the boss, or they feel bad about going home when everyone else is at work. And it sounds very convincing. They argue that it's a cultural phenomenon and that something needs to be done about it. If that were true, why is it that the smaller a company is, the lower the level of holiday taken is, and the larger a company is, the more holiday that people are taking is? If this were a cultural phenomenon, you would expect to see the uptake of paid leave to be similar across the whole economy, but it isn't. If you look, for example, at the participation of women, you find exactly the same structure. People will say, well, Japanese, I mean, to be politically very incorrect about this, people will say Japan is a Confucian-based economy and Japanese men and Japanese companies are all sexist. Well, if that were true, you would expect almost all companies to be sexist in a similar fashion because we're talking about the male population. But that's not what we find. We find exactly the same phenomenon, which is that female participation increases the larger the corporate size is. And that's true not only in Japan, but in also other parts of the world, and is logically what you would expect. When I run a small company, it's only 75 people. Recently, our head of accounting retired. There were 3 people, now there's only 1 because I've made it more efficient. And when I went to hire somebody to take over her job, I found myself not able to hire a young female because the head of accounting is also the only person who does accounting. And I can't, from a compliance perspective, have somebody take a year off for maternity leave because I can't outsource that very, very vital process for just 1 year. And so I find myself being forced to hire a male head of accounting. And there are many other examples of why that's the case. It's just one very, very simple example. So I think what you're suggesting is it sounds very convincing that maybe there's going to be an epiphany here. But having said that, I've waited for an epiphany moment for 30 years. And over that period, I've heard every story under the sun and nothing has changed for 30 years. And I think of the analysis that I've done, I think I personally believe very strongly that I have found out why it is that none of these stories ever end up in producing an economic benefit.
That's a good question to segue on to a question from John Chipman, Director General of the IISS CEO, of course. And John writes, a fascinating presentation. We spoke most about the inefficiencies of the small and micro business centre. What if the very large corporations find that they can maintain productivity or even increase it by discharging the less productive part of the workforce and downsize but work smarter? Would unemployment numbers rise alarmingly, or would population decrease to deal with that conveniently? And in any case, what can the behemoth companies do to become more productive? Yeah,
I mean, it's interesting actually because the question at the end there uses the sort of behemoth argument. If you look around the world and you look at the 500 largest companies in terms of revenues, employment, capital base, and various other factors, Japan has 52 of the world's largest companies, only 1 in the top 10, even though it's the world's 3rd largest economy, and only 4 in the top 50. If you look at the industry subsections of that, I forget exactly what the number is, but it's 100 and some odd, as I remember, industry groups that are included in that analysis. Japan is only top in 2 categories in the world. Now, Switzerland has the largest company in 3 sectors. The US, I think, has, as I remember, the US has, I think, somewhere around about 26 or 27 sectors in which they have the largest company. In many cases, they also have the number 2 and number 3. And interesting enough, of those 2 sectors in which Japan is the largest, one of them is Toyota, and the other one is Nippon Life. That's not that's not your largest presence globally. That's your absolute size globally relative to other global size companies. Nippon Life, of course, is a predominantly domestic company, and one of the reasons for that is because Nippon Life has an absolutely massive market share in Japan, which has one of the world's largest life insurance sectors. If you look at the rest of Japanese industrial sectors, I used to be a bank analyst. And when I first started in 1990, there were 21 major banks, national banks in Japan, whereas of course in the UK, which is half the size of Japan, in the UK at the time there were 4. And in the UK, in the US, which at the time was 1.5 times the size of Japan, is now 4 times the size of Japan. At that time, large commercial banks, I think there were 5 or 6 at the time. There were 21 in Japan. And in one of the pieces of analysis I did in 1998, I remember, if you took the Japanese commercial banking sector and you created the same size as the size relative to the size of GDP and the population, various other measures for Europe and the US, Japan would only need 2 to 4 major banks. It was a very famous piece of analysis that I produced. I was most surprised that 2 years later we were down to 3 from 17 at the time. So I think behemoth is it's Japan. We tend to think it's a big country, big companies, but actually if you go and do the numbers, you will in almost all cases find that relative to big countries, big companies in other big countries, Japanese companies are actually not that large. When I was a bank analyst, and this is 2000 numbers as I remember, Tokyo Mitsubishi, which was the largest bank in the world in asset size at the time, I haven't bothered to follow it since then, employed around about 40,000 people. Citibank employed 500,000. 500,000 is a big company. 50,000 people was, I think Goldman Sachs was 40,000 when I left, 36,000, 37,000, somewhere around about there. And investment banking, of course, is considered to be a niche. So I think the assumption that Japanese large companies are behemoths is true for Japan, but not true globally. Relative to the EU, the productivity of a large Japanese company as defined by Japanese standards is 2% higher than is true for Europe and around about 9% lower than is true for the US. And it comes back to the point, which is that, when you look at productivity, either you have productivity differences between countries are either going to be because all levels of productivity are low relative to the same classes in the rest of the world, and there are very few examples of that I would mention in the developed world, or, and this is actually the case for Japan, if you have exactly the same levels of productivity for each of the different size classes, but you have a very large percentage of your employment base in large companies, then it follows that if productivity of large companies is twice the level of small companies, and you have 50% of your population in large companies relative to 20% of your population in large companies, then mathematically, of course, the US is going to have much higher levels of productivity than is going to be the case for Japan. And you can't change that to any statistically significant level by improving the productivity of large companies in Japan. It's simply, if you read Japanese, I have a book on this, and you can get the numbers from my book. And if you get out a calculator, there is no way that you can get to the same level of productivity for Japan that the US has with the size distribution of Japanese companies as it stands today. It's mathematically not possible.
Thank you, David. I'm going to try and do something impossible, I think, and that's squeeze 3 questions into 10 minutes. So
Okay.
The challenge is on. I've got a hand that's up here from Sunjin Choi, I think. Sunjin Choi, would you like to speak?
Good evening. Thank you so much for your lucid remark. May I follow your remark and Cassie Matsui, who was your former colleague at Goldman Sachs. She called Womanomics in 1999.
Right.
Would you open your views on past 21 years when Womanomics, A, what has changed, B, what has not? Especially in light of what happened, Japanese Central Bank just appointed first woman ED in 138 years. Thank you very much.
Sunjin Choi, could you identify yourself, your affiliation, please?
Do apologies. Sunjin Choi, Langham Partners in US.
Okay. Yeah, I think there's I think it raises a very interesting point. There is a focus on increasing the number of senior female executives. And I certainly would not argue that there is no value to that, because clearly there is. Having said that, it must be the case that since slightly more than half, well, actually slightly less than half of the population is female, that having one person at the Bank of Japan who is female appointed as executive in and of itself is statistically insignificant. And this comes back to the point I was making, is so much of what happens in Japan is done on the basis of catchphrases and stories, concepts. We need more female participation. Let's have a female at the Bank of Japan, and then we can all jump up and down, sing the Hallelujah chorus and say, okay, fine, we've done it. But unless that becomes, unless that becomes the tip of the iceberg, then it's not going to be statistically significant. And that has nothing to do with Kathy's arguments. All I'm saying is, just because, you've got somebody at a visible level who is female, you must go down and check to see whether there's anything below the water level. Because if there isn't, then all you're looking at is a statistically insignificant but very visible sort of flagship style event that will not have any significant economic significance to an economy which, let's face it, is 560 trillion yen in size. You need to have millions of female employees who are empowered at all levels of the organization and who are utilized at all levels of the organization, or at least the corporate structure, throughout the whole country. Just having one woman there isn't going to make much of a difference. And that, again, comes back to my point, which is that if you work for a large company, it is very easy, or it is relatively easier, to accommodate the different needs of female employees relative to male employees, and to create a structure which is more flexible, because by definition, a larger employment base is more flexible than a small one is. And if you have very, very small companies being the vast majority of your employment, and I would encourage you to look at Italy and Spain and Korea, which have exactly the same problems. If you only employ 3 people, it is very difficult to have a maternity-paternity strategy in place when you only have 3 people, 3.4 people, which is the average number of people employed at the vast majority of Japanese companies. And when you have 30% of the population employed in companies that employ less than 30 people, relative to less than 10%, which is true for most companies in countries in places in Europe and the US, it becomes very, very difficult to provide the flexibility required to empower the female workforce against the context of that corporate structure.
Thank you, David. I'm going to group the final 2 questions together, quite different, but in the interest of time. The first one from Boris Ninov. Dear David Atkinson, do you think the current economic crisis between the US and China will have an impact on the economic structure of Japan and its priorities, affecting the 4th industrial revolution there? And the second one from Nobuyasu Abe, Senior Advisor, Council on Strategic Risks. It seems population growth is critical for future growth. What do you recommend Japan should be doing?
Okay. The first one, China, I think not. I'm not sure it will have that much of an impact, because Japan is a very domestically driven economy, and I'm sure it will have, there'll be lots of chit chat going on and lots of policy response and various other things, but will it make an impact? No, it will not. What should Japan do? They've fallen into a very, very simple trap, which is exactly the same trap that's been fallen into in, as I keep mentioning, Italy, Spain, to a less extent, South Korea, and a lot of the European economies, which is if you provide financial support to a subset of your economy, then economic resources will begin to concentrate in that area. And if the subsector of the economy that you choose to subsidize is highly unproductive and based upon low quality jobs with very, very small input from capital and technology, then you will create an economic structure which is highly inefficient. And the argument that I keep making to the government is, in order to deal with that, you need to do the following things. The definition of a SME in Europe is 250 people or less, with the tremendously important exceptions of Germany, Denmark, Sweden, and a lot of other Northern European countries. The further south you get, tax incentives, advantages are provided to micro companies in Europe at twice the rate that they are to medium-sized companies in Europe, and almost no benefits are given to the large corporate sector. And as a result of that, you create an industrial structure which is deeply inefficient. The definition of an SME in Japan is 300 in manufacturing, 100 in services, and 50 in retail, which means that if you employ 51 people, you are a large company in retail in Japan. I think if you then said 51 people in Japan is a large company, which puts it in the same category as Walmart, I think 51, I think Walmart, last time I checked, employs a few more people than 51. They are categorized in the same way. They need to change the definition, the standard definition in the US of an SME is 500 people or less. Germany, interesting enough, is 500 people or less. China is even bigger. And not surprisingly, people bunch at the exact level at which you set the definition. So they need to change the definition of what an SME is. It needs to be at least 500. They need to stop providing these ridiculous subsidies to SMEs based purely on the fact that they're small companies. And they need to start providing incentives for companies to grow. If you look at the difference between Europe and the US in terms of its productivity growth, the single largest difference is that the US corporate structure is more dynamic. More companies grow. Very few companies stay the same size. They either leave, exit, or they grow. People always focus on the US and their exit, but the reality is that the vast majority of the benefits in productivity growth in the US relative to Europe come from the fact that they have a much higher growth rate for medium-sized companies than anywhere else in the developed world. Japan has the lowest rate of business dynamism in the world for a large developed country. And the reason for that is because of what they call the bunching effect, these very, very small definitions of medium and small size companies, and the enormous, the trillions and trillions of yen that they throw at these companies, which incentivize them to remain small, and to remain small enough that 4G, 5G, or any other G, if you employ 3.4 million people, big data is not a concept that you will ever be able to leverage. If you ask the reason, why does Japan have the highest percentage of fax machines in the world for a developed country? Why is their level of technology so pathetically low relative to the rest of the world? People will always say they need to spend more, but if you look at not the result, but if you look at why it is that Japanese companies spend so less on so small amount of money on technology, and I'll come back to this again, you come back to exactly the same point, which is that around the world, large companies spend huge amounts on technology. The smaller a company becomes, the less it will spend. And therefore, this is not a question of Japan as a whole spending less and therefore needing to spend more. And if you just subsidize companies, they would all go off and spend more. It is a result of the fact that the vast majority of your corporate base is not of a size large enough to be able to produce the economies of scale to be able to invest in technology. And if you give people, if you give 3 million companies with 3.4 employees on average each access to money so they can go off and export, access to big data or supercomputers, how are you going to leverage the computing capacity of a supercomputer when you have 3.4 employees? You're always going to come back to this issue.
Thank you, David. I'm going to have to draw this amazing discussion to a halt here. I think we could go on all afternoon or night or wherever you are, but David, you've been absolutely spectacular as a guest, taking us through Japan's policy choices in such detail, but explaining it so accessibly for us. So a huge round of virtual applause, I'm sure, is going around the world at the moment to say thank you for your input today. We're very grateful for your time, and I know you've had a long day discussing policy again today with various people. So many thanks from the IISS and from you.
Thank you very much, and thank you everyone for your questions.
Yes, we had some fantastic questions.
Very good questions.
We will, of course, be running further Japan Chair Programme webinars and events, hopefully in person at some point, Please keep an eye out on the IISS's website and on our social media channels for future events. We'd love to have you join and be part of the discussion as well. So once again, big thank you to David, and thank you to all our audience as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.